The room was thick with tension, the kind that presses against the skin like heat before a storm. Eleanor Vance stood small at the end of a polished mahogany table, her hands trembling as whispers curled through the air like smoke. Wealthy board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions a mixture of doubt and disdain. At the head of the table, Penelope Covington smiled the cruel smile of someone who smelled weakness. Words like unworthy, inappropriate, and misuse of funds hung in the air, sharpened into accusations. Every eye in the room seemed to pierce Eleanor's fragile armor. For a moment she felt stripped bare, reduced to nothing but a poor single mother accused of exploiting a man she barely knew. The fate of her daughter's future teetered on the edge. A hush fell, heavy and suffocating. And then, the story snapped backward to where it all began. Fluorescent lights hummed above, their harsh glow bleaching the color from everything. The checkout scanner sang its cruel rhythm. Bread, oatmeal, vegetables, each beep a drumbeat of inevitability. Eleanor clutched her cracked leather wallet as sweat dampened her palms. Then came the formula, the single can her baby Daisy needed to survive without pain. The price glared back at her from the screen, higher than the fragile stack of wrinkled bills she had counted 3 times that morning. Shame scorched her cheeks as murmurs rose from impatient shoppers behind. With her throat tight, she whispered words no mother should ever say. She slid the formula back across the counter, her chest hollowing with defeat. The cashier's bored indifference stung worse than insults. A line of sighs followed her every move. In that moment, Eleanor felt invisible and yet entirely exposed, her dignity stripped by a simple machine's merciless beeping.
Not far away, a man paused in his errands. James Caldwell, a figure known in glossy magazines as a billionaire visionary, stood still in an aisle lined with juice bottles. His daughter Sophia clutched his hand, unaware of what her father's eyes had just captured. For years, James had moved through life insulated by wealth, accustomed to poverty being statistics in annual reports, figures discussed at charity galas. But here, poverty was raw, carved into the trembling hands of a young woman forced to surrender her child's lifeline. The ordinary setting, the fluorescent lights, the rattling carts, the bland hum of commerce, became the stage for an unbearable injustice. As Eleanor turned from the register, shoulders sagging, James felt a pull unlike anything in boardrooms or stock markets. Something deep and long dormant stirred within him. Compassion struck hard, raw, and personal. For the first time in years, he felt powerless if he remained still. The automatic doors opened with a whoosh, and the evening air carried no comfort. Eleanor stepped into the parking lot clutching a single thin bag, its contents pitiful against the needs of a growing baby. Her shoes scuffed the pavement, each step heavy with humiliation. Around her, carts rattled, families laughed, shoppers packed trunks with abundance. She moved among them like a ghost, unseen yet judged by every glance that slid her way. The bus stop loomed on the far edge, a cold metal bench waiting beneath the buzzing glare of a lone light. She sank onto it, head bowed, fighting tears she couldn't afford to shed. In her chest, failure ached like a physical wound. For Daisy, she had promised the impossible. And tonight, she had broken that promise. Alone in the crowd, Eleanor was a mother carrying shame heavier than any grocery bag.
From the blur of headlights and passing voices, footsteps approached. A hand appeared in Eleanor's vision, holding the very can she had been forced to abandon. Shock pierced through her shame, but instinct wrapped her pride like armor. Her pulse pounded as humiliation burned fresh. Accepting it would be surrendering to pity, acknowledging to the world that she could not provide. Yet beneath the roar of pride came a softer cry, the cry of Daisy, her little girl waiting at home with hunger too delicate to fight. Eleanor's breath trembled as the battle raged inside her. dignity against survival, pride against love. Finally, love triumphed. With tears clouding her eyes, she accepted the can, her hand closing over the weight of mercy. In that instant, shame and gratitude collided, and her life quietly veered toward a path she could not yet imagine. The air had cooled as dusk spread across the lot, buses running late, shadows stretching long. Eleanor clutched her bag, the formula nestled inside like a fragile treasure. Then came an offer, a ride, a way out of the night's humiliation. Her instincts screamed resistance. Pride whispered that accepting more help would chain her deeper into shame. But then she glanced at the child who stood by the stranger's side, Sophia, with wide, innocent eyes, curious and unburdened. For a moment, Eleanor saw not wealth or pity, but two parents sharing silent recognition of what mattered most, their children. The hesitation broke. She rose from the cold bench and walked toward the waiting car, surrendering to practicality. Her pulse raced, a cocktail of fear and relief, as she realized that sometimes survival meant allowing the kindness of strangers to bridge the unbearable gap of need.
The car's warmth vanished when Eleanor opened the door to her apartment. The hallway smelled of damp carpet and old paint. The flickering bulb above buzzed like an irritated insect, casting shadows across peeling walls. Inside, the space was cramped, furniture secondhand, every corner whispering of struggle. Yet within the modest clutter stood symbols of love. Baby pictures framed despite their worn edges, neatly folded blankets stacked beside a small crib, and Daisy's toys arranged with care. James scanned the room in silence. To him, wealth had always filled empty spaces with expensive silence. But here, emptiness was crowded out by love. Eleanor's cheeks burned as she set down the groceries, her shame magnified by the contrast between her world and the stranger's polished shoes on her threadbare rug. Still, pride remained, because Daisy's laughter filled the room, louder and more radiant than the apartment's poverty could ever mute. As Eleanor lifted Daisy from her crib, pressing her close with a sigh of exhausted devotion, James felt an ache he had long concealed. His own mansion was vast, immaculate, and utterly silent. Since losing his wife, it had echoed with a loneliness he could not smother with riches or routines. Sophia's presence anchored him, but even that love was often mediated through hired hands, nannies, and caretakers. Watching Eleanor cradle Daisy in a room sparse yet alive, James glimpsed something unfamiliar. A home brimming with love despite emptiness. Their worlds could not have been further apart, yet in that moment, grief and devotion mirrored one another. She clung to her child out of desperation. He clung to his wealth out of emptiness. For both, the loss was palpable, unspoken. What divided them was staggering, but what bound them was even greater. Love born from absence.
On a chipped shelf, beside worn library books and faded photographs, lay a tarnished dog tag. Its dull metal caught the faint light, and James froze as his gaze fell upon it. Numbers and letters etched into its surface echoed a history he had heard whispered in his own family stories. His grandfather's tales of war, of men who fought side by side in mud and terror, stirred like ghosts in his memory. The insignia was unmistakable. It connected Eleanor's bloodline to his own history, a bond forged long before these two strangers crossed paths. James's breath caught, though he said nothing. That relic, unnoticed in Eleanor's daily struggle, had just linked poverty and fortune through legacy. A thread had revealed itself, weaving her humiliation with his privilege into a single inevitable tapestry of destiny stretching back more than 70 years. Back in the sterile vastness of his office, James sat surrounded by glass and steel, yet his thoughts lingered on that fragile apartment and the tarnished dog tag. His security chief, David, laid down a thin folder of information, Eleanor's history, her struggles, her lineage. The pages confirmed what his heart already suspected. Her great-grandfather was Sergeant Michael Vance, the very man whose heroism had once saved James's own grandfather's life. The revelation hit like thunder, both humbling and undeniable. This was no chance encounter, it was legacy demanding repayment. James's wealth had often been scattered across anonymous charities, faceless causes, but this was different. This was personal. Quietly, deliberately, he began crafting a new path, the Vance Legacy Grant. Not charity, not pity, but a bridge of honor across generations. He would not hand her money, he would hand her a chance to rewrite her life.
The seed of the grant grew quickly. Draft proposals were drawn, legal frameworks assembled, funds allocated quietly from his vast empire. Yet James knew this act carried weight unlike any boardroom initiative. It wasn't a donation, it was an old debt being paid forward. In his mind, he saw his grandfather's weathered face, heard his voice speaking of Sergeant Vance with reverence. That debt had sat like an unspoken promise in the family's veins for decades. Now fate had placed its collection in James's hands. He imagined Eleanor, head bowed beneath fluorescent lights, forced to surrender her child's formula. He imagined Daisy's future, balanced on the fragile shoulders of her mother. For the first time in years, his wealth wasn't a fortress to hide behind. It was a tool for justice. The grant was born not out of kindness, but out of honor long overdue. While James quietly moved pieces in powerful rooms, Eleanor's own battle played out on a kitchen table scratched and unstable. Daisy napped in the corner, soft breaths rising from her crib, while Eleanor hunched over job ads clipped from newspapers. Circles of ink marked opportunities that always seemed just out of reach, requiring degrees she didn't have or hours impossible for a single mother. Her hands ached from diner shifts, her eyes blurred from fatigue, yet she refused surrender. With trembling fingers she began rewriting an old resume, each word an act of hope clawing against despair. A chipped mug of cold coffee sat beside her, but determination burned hotter. Pride whispered she had failed, but Daisy's need silenced that voice. Each circled ad was not ink on paper. It was a promise, fragile yet unbroken, that she would rise again no matter the weight pressing her down.
The phone rang with a tone that seemed out of place in her cramped apartment. Eleanor answered, heart quickening. On the line, a voice from the Veterans Community Center invited her for an interview. For a moment, disbelief froze her. Then, hope ignited, fragile but bright. She raced to prepare, pulling out the only blouse she owned that could pass as professional. She ironed it until steam rose into the air like a prayer. For the first time in months, her mirror reflected not just exhaustion, but determination painted across tired features. That night, she rehearsed answers quietly while Daisy slept, whispering promises into the dark. It wasn't a grand opportunity, but it was a door cracked open. For a mother drowning daily in survival, it was a lifeline. She clutched it tight, ready to walk into that interview with the full weight of hope on her shoulders. The interview began with polite warmth, Eleanor's words steady despite her trembling hands. She spoke of her great-grandfather's service, of her longing to contribute, of the pride she carried even amid struggle. The director smiled, impressed. But then the blow came. The position had already been filled. Eleanor's stomach dropped, hope splintering like fragile glass. She forced composure, ready to accept defeat once more. But the director's hand slid a paper across the desk. A new program, fresh, unconventional, was being launched, the Vance Legacy Grant. Eleanor's eyes widened as she read her own last name in bold letters at the top. Confusion and disbelief tangled within her. Could such a thing be real? This was not charity. It was opportunity dressed in honor. For the first time, humiliation gave way to possibility, though she could not yet see the unseen hands guiding her future.
The grant changed the air around Eleanor. With its support, she moved Daisy into a safer apartment. Small, but filled with sunlight. The first night, Daisy laughed as she toddled across new carpet, a sound that seemed to bless every corner. Eleanor enrolled in community college, determination replacing despair. Nights that once dissolved into exhausted tears became hours at a small second-hand desk, textbooks spread wide, coffee brewing strong. It wasn't easy. Assignments challenged her, fatigue clawed at her. But each page she turned was a step toward something larger than survival. Her neighbors noticed the difference, her stride quicker, her eyes less clouded. Daisy thrived, blooming like a flower finally watered. Humiliation had not vanished, but it was no longer her constant companion. For the first time since surrendering that formula can, Eleanor felt momentum pushing forward, as though destiny itself had shifted its weight to her side. One afternoon, Eleanor received a call from Mrs. Gable, the director of the center. The voice on the other end carried both excitement and expectation. A formal reception was being planned to launch the Vance Legacy Grant. Donors would gather, community leaders would attend, and Eleanor was asked to be there. Not only present, but speaking as the program's first recipient. The request landed like a stone in her chest. Public speaking had always been her terror. Now she was to stand before strangers whose lives bore no resemblance to her own. Fear wrestled with obligation. But beneath it, gratitude stirred, reminding her of the unseen benefactor whose gift had changed her life. She agreed, though her hands shook as she set down the phone. That night, Daisy gurgled softly in sleep, while Eleanor sat with paper and pen, drafting words to carry her fragile hope into a spotlight.
The night of the reception arrived, and Eleanor stepped into the hall with her clearance rack dress and secondhand shoes. The room sparkled with wealth, diamonds catching the light, tailored suits gliding across polished floors. Conversations hummed with practiced ease, laughter ringing sharp like glass. Eleanor's breath shortened as she felt the weight of eyes sliding over her, measuring, dismissing. She clutched her purse tighter, her posture shrinking beneath the silent judgment. In her chest, the old humiliation stirred again, reminding her of the grocery store, the sneers of strangers, the sharp ache of inadequacy. Yet she kept moving because Daisy's future depended on her presence here. Then, across the crowded room, her gaze landed on a familiar face, James Caldwell. Recognition slammed through her. Confusion mingled with disbelief. The man who had handed her the formula stood among the elite, calm and composed, as though fate had orchestrated every step. Eleanor's pulse pounded as introductions swirled. Mrs. Gable, beaming, announced James Caldwell as the benefactor behind the Vance Legacy Grant. The room applauded, but Eleanor's world tilted. The pieces fell into place. The formula in the parking lot, the offer of help, the shadow of a man who disappeared into the night. He had been there all along, not as a passing stranger, but as the architect of her second chance. The revelation carried both weight and relief, overwhelming in its clarity. For weeks she had wondered who had seen her, who had chosen her name from countless others. Now the answer stood before her. The wealthiest man in the room who had once knelt to place dignity in her trembling hands. Gratitude swelled, tangled with disbelief, as if the universe had bent itself to bring a poor mother and a billionaire face to face in destiny's spotlight.
Later, away from the noise of crystal glasses and practiced speeches, Eleanor found herself in the quiet of a side patio. The night air was cool, carrying with it a clarity that words struggled to capture. James spoke not of wealth or charity, but of lineage, of grandfathers bound by war. He revealed the bond she never knew existed. Sergeant Michael Vance and Corporal Thomas Caldwell, lives intertwined on a battlefield long before hers began. The grant was no accident, no indulgence of pity. It was repayment of a debt of honor, generations in the making. The revelation washed over Eleanor like absolution. Humiliation softened into reverence. Her poverty, her struggle, her humiliation, all were suddenly linked to something greater than herself. She was not merely a recipient, she was a descendant of sacrifice, chosen not for weakness, but because her very blood carried history worth honoring. The fragile peace was broken by the arrival of Penelope Covington, her presence sharp as perfume and as suffocating. Tall, elegant, and dripping with wealth, she carried herself with the authority of someone who believed the world was hers to govern. Her eyes slid over Eleanor's dress, shoes, and posture in a single sweep, the judgment immediate and unkind. Her words, wrapped in polite tone, dripped with condescension. To her, Eleanor was not a woman of resilience, but merely the recipient, a token to parade before donors. Beneath her smile was disdain, the belief that this poor mother did not belong in such a room. For Eleanor, humiliation flared again, but now it burned differently. It was not silent submission, it was the sting of insult demanding defiance. The lines of conflict sharpened in that instant. This woman would become the face of every gatekeeper Eleanor had ever fought against.
When her name was called, Eleanor's steps to the podium felt heavier than stone. Dozens of eyes bore into her, wealth and privilege staring down a woman who had once begged a cashier to take back her baby's milk. The notes in her trembling hand blurred, useless. She looked out into the crowd, saw Daisy's future hanging in the balance, and found her voice not in paper, but in truth. Words spilled raw, the humiliation of the grocery store, the ache of broken promises, the crushing weight of poverty. She spoke of her great-grandfather not as a distant hero, but as a man whose courage still demanded honor. And then she spoke of hope, the kind that comes when one act of compassion cracks open the impossible. When she finished, silence hung for a breath, then applause erupted, a tidal wave of recognition that stripped humiliation from her shoulders. Applause could not silence envy. In the days that followed, Penelope Covington wove her poison with practiced ease. In whispered corners of the boardroom and hushed conversations among donors, she seeded doubts. Was the grant truly impartial, or was it favoritism masked as philanthropy? Were funds being diverted to indulge a billionaire's private interest in a struggling young woman? Her insinuations were never spoken directly, but they clung to conversations like shadows. Eleanor became the target of suspicion she could not answer. The dignity she had fought to reclaim threatened to crumble beneath rumors she did not deserve. Her chest tightened as familiar shame resurfaced. Humiliation not at a cash register, but now in boardrooms where power sat smug and untouchable. What had begun as hope risked twisting into scandal. The whispers spread like wildfire, each one cutting deeper into her fragile new beginning.
The rumors hardened into policy. The board, uneasy under Penelope's influence, voted to freeze the Vance legacy grant until a formal review could be conducted. For Eleanor, the announcement fell like a guillotine. The stipend she relied upon was halted, her rent due in days, her fragile stability shattered. She sat in the dim kitchen, staring at the eviction notice she feared would follow. The humiliation of the grocery store returned, sharper, because now hope itself had betrayed her. Daisy played at her feet, oblivious, her laughter both comfort and torment. Eleanor pressed her hands against her face, tears sliding hot and bitter. Poverty was a prison she had briefly escaped, only to be dragged back by invisible chains of power. The cruelest cut was not the struggle itself, but the reminder of what she had almost grasped, a future that seemed to dissolve in Penelope's shadowed victory. The day of the board hearing arrived. Eleanor entered the room not as a guest, but as a defendant on trial. Penelope sat at the head, her polished nails tapping against the table with smug rhythm. The words that followed were veiled in professionalism, but their message was clear. Eleanor was unworthy, her grant tainted by impropriety. The humiliation was suffocating, but this time, Eleanor did not shrink. Rising to her feet, she addressed the board with a voice forged in fire. She declared herself not a charity case, but the descendant of a hero, standing not for pity, but for legacy. Her words cut through the fog of suspicion, her gaze steady. Every humiliation she had endured, every act of survival, now fueled her defiance. For once, she refused invisibility. The room shifted, unease rippling as power began to bend toward truth. The battle was no longer silent.
As tension mounted, James Caldwell rose from his seat at the far end of the table. In his hands lay a leather-bound journal, worn from age. He placed it gently on the polished wood, opening to pages inked decades earlier by his grandfather. Words of a battlefield filled the room, recounting the bravery of Sergeant Michael Vance, the man who had saved lives with unflinching courage. Beside the journal, James laid photographs, grainy images of young men in uniform, one face belonging to Eleanor's bloodline. Medals and commendations followed, proof of valor that no rumor could erase. The evidence was irrefutable. The grant was not indulgence, but repayment of a sacred debt. The silence that followed was thunderous. Penelope's whispers crumbled under the weight of history. What had been cast as scandal was revealed as legacy, binding Eleanor's humiliation to honor, too powerful to deny. Despite the evidence, hesitation lingered among the board. Fear of appearances still hung heavy. Then, James Caldwell spoke words that stunned the room. He offered his resignation from his own foundation, declaring he would step down rather than allow the grant to be tainted by suspicion. Gasps rippled across the table. Wealth and power were not enough. Here was a man willing to sacrifice his empire to protect a single mother's dignity. The weight of his offer broke through hesitation like a hammer shattering glass. To refuse now would be to reject not only a woman's future, but the honor of two families bound by history. The gamble was absolute, the cost unimaginable. Yet it was not pity that guided him. It was legacy. His voice carried conviction, echoing across the room like a verdict. Humiliation had met its equal in sacrifice, and the balance began to shift.
The vote that followed was swift, unanimous, and resounding. The Vance Legacy Grant would not only continue, but expand, becoming a permanent pillar of the foundation. Penelope's influence evaporated, her whispered poison exposed as jealousy masquerading as governance. She resigned quietly, stripped of her power. For Eleanor, vindication washed over her like cleansing fire. What began as humiliation had ended as triumph, her name no longer burdened by pity, but elevated by legacy. Applause filled the boardroom, but it was not the applause of charity, it was recognition, respect, and honor. The weight of shame lifted, replaced by pride that belonged not only to her, but to Daisy, and to the generations before her who had sacrificed in silence. In that moment, Eleanor stood taller than wealth, stronger than whispers. She had endured humiliation, but she had risen into a place of dignity, unshakable and undeniable. Time carried her forward, reshaping the fragile girl at the checkout line into a woman of resilience. Eleanor completed her degree in business administration, walking across a graduation stage with honors. She now worked within the Caldwell Foundation, directing the very program that had once saved her life. The Vance Legacy Grant reached families across the state, pulling others from the brink of despair, honoring veterans' descendants with opportunity instead of silence. Eleanor no longer walked with bowed head. Her stride was confident, her voice commanding. Daisy thrived beside her, no longer a child of survival, but of possibility. The humiliation that once defined her had transformed into fuel, powering her every step forward. What had begun as a single can of formula returned in shame had grown into a legacy touching countless lives. Poverty had not vanished, but dignity had risen to face it. On a sunlit afternoon, laughter drifted across a green park. Daisy, now confident on her feet, ran beside Sophia, the two girls weaving between swings and chasing butterflies, as though they were sisters by birth. On a blanket spread across the grass, Eleanor leaned into James's shoulder, comfort replacing distance. Their partnership had grown not from wealth or dependence, but from respect forged in shared battles. Around them, families strolled, unaware that two lives once divided by wealth had converged into unity. Eleanor's eyes softened as she watched her daughter laugh, joy unshadowed by need. For years, humiliation had weighed on her like a chain, but now its echo had transformed into strength. She was no longer the woman forced to surrender her child's milk. She was a mother who had rebuilt her life, surrounded by love, her past pain now a foundation of triumph. Back inside the same grocery store where her humiliation began, Eleanor noticed a young mother at the register, her eyes brimming with shame. The scene was achingly familiar. A baby's formula lifted, then hesitantly pushed back. Time folded in on itself. Eleanor stepped forward, her hand reaching out not with pity, but with solidarity. She placed the formula gently into the woman's hands, her voice unspoken yet clear, from one parent to another. In that simple act, the cycle turned. What had begun as humiliation now ended as grace, a legacy passed forward like a torch. Daisy's laughter echoed faintly from the stroller beside her, the sound of a future secured. Eleanor walked away, shoulders no longer bent beneath the weight of shame, but lifted by dignity and purpose. A can of formula had once broken her, but now it was the symbol of everything she had become.